They rerouted their stormwater straight onto my land. They didn't ask, didn't warn me, didn't even pretend to hide it. And when I finally realized what they'd done, I knew one of us was about to learn an expensive lesson. I lived just outside a little town in western Kentucky, the kind of place where people still wave when they pass you on a 2-lane road. My property sits lower than the new subdivision that went up about 3 years ago on the ridge behind me. When I bought this land 15 years back, it was nothing but open pasture, a red barn that needed more love than money, and enough room for a couple of horses and some peace of mind. That was the point. I'd done my time working construction in Louisville, saved up, and when my dad passed, I used the inheritance to buy something solid, something that didn't answer back. The lower pasture had always been the wettest part of the property, sure, but it drained fine. We'd get heavy rains every spring, the kind that beat on the tin roof all night, and by the next afternoon, the ground would be firm again. The soil there had handled storms for decades. My neighbor, Arthur, who's pushing 70 and remembers. When this whole area was tobacco fields, used to say that land was smarter than most people. It knew how to drink and when to let go. So when we got hit with that week of rain last April, I wasn't worried at first. It came down hard and steady, gray skies that never seemed to lift, the creek at the edge of my property swelling but still inside its banks. I kept the horses closer to the barn, tossed extra hay, figured we'd ride it out like always. But on the 6th morning, I stepped outside and something felt off. The air had that swampy smell, thick and sour. I walked down toward the lower pasture and my boots sank deeper than they should have. By the time I reached the fence line, I was standing in ankle-deep water. Not puddles, not soft ground. A wide, ugly sheet of standing water stretching across half the field. Mud swirling with bits of trash, plastic wrappers, cigarette butts, and this oily sheen that caught the light in a way rainwater never does. The grass where my horses usually grazed was flattened and yellowing already, suffocating under it. And the worst part was how the water pressed up against the side of my barn. Not flooding yet, but close enough to make me picture it seeping through the foundation. Soaking feed, ruining tack, warping what I'd spent years repairing. I just stood there for a minute, hands on my hips, listening to nothing but the drip of water off the eaves. This wasn't normal. I'd seen worse storms. The land had never looked like this. That's when I decided to walk the fence line. Now, the back edge of my property runs along a tall retaining wall that belongs to the subdivision above me. Cedar Creek Estates. That's what they call it. Big brick entrance, iron gates that don't actually close. A little sign about community standards and architectural review. Most of the folks up there are decent enough. Keep to themselves. Mow twice a week. Drive shiny SUVs. But about halfway down that wall, something caught my eye. A clean, pale circle of concrete cutting straight through the stone. Fresh. Too fresh. It looked like a giant had shoved a pipe through the wall and snapped it off right at my side of the fence. The end of it stuck out maybe a foot, angled slightly downward. And right below it, the ground was gouged out like a miniature canyon. I walked closer, crouched down, and that's when I saw it clearly. A brand new storm drain pipe. 12 inches across, easy, still sharp-edged, and judging by the debris caught around it, it had been working overtime. I followed the line of it with my eyes, up through the wall, and suddenly it clicked. They'd built a retention pond up there when the second phase of the subdivision went in. I remembered the bulldozers, the dump trucks, the way the hillside looked, scraped raw for months. I never paid much attention to what they were doing with the water, figured it was their problem. Turns out, it was now mine. Instead of designing proper drainage that kept runoff inside their own boundaries, they'd punched a pipe straight through the retaining wall and let gravity do the rest. And gravity led right to my pasture. I felt that slow burn start in my chest. Not explosive anger, not yet. Just that steady heat you get when you realize someone has decided your property is the cheapest solution to their inconvenience. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The pipe, the water line, the trash, the oil slick, the way the flow had carved a channel through my field. I took a video too, just in case. Then I climbed back up to the house and called the number listed for Cedar Creek's property manager, a guy named Marcus Holloway. I'd met him once at a county meeting about road access. Slick hair, pressed shirt. The kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. He answered on the third ring. Okay, Cedar Creek Estates. This is Marcus. Yeah, Marcus, this is Thomas Vance. I own the pasture directly below your retaining wall. Pause. All right, I'm looking at a brand new storm pipe sticking through that wall and dumping straight onto my land. Care to explain that? Another? Pause, shorter this time, then a sigh. Like I was the one inconveniencing him. Oh, that. Yeah, that's part of the updated drainage plan. We had to improve runoff flow from the retention basin. Improve it for who? I asked. Well, the water has to go somewhere. Thomas, your property sits at the lowest elevation. It's natural drainage. I actually laughed at that. Couldn't help it. Natural. A concrete pipe blasting thousands of gallons into my field is natural. It's standard practice, he said, voice turning clipped. And it's within code. Did you get an easement from me? Silence. No, he said finally. We didn't need one. That was the moment something shifted inside me. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was the assumption, it's a quiet belief that because my land was lower, because I didn't live behind brick signs and HOA bylaws, it was acceptable collateral. I'll be in touch, I told him, and hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. I stood there in my kitchen, looking out over that flooded pasture, and I had a feeling this wasn't going to be settled with a polite phone call. I didn't sleep much that night. Rain has a different sound when you know where it's headed. Every drop hitting the roof felt like it was passing through the shingles, down the hill, and straight into that pipe. I kept picturing the water building behind that wall, funneling into my pasture like I'd signed some invisible contract, agreeing to store their overflow. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped by the county planning office. Beige building, flickering fluorescent lights, a coffee machine that looked older than I was. I brought printed photos, highlighted timestamps, even drew a little map showing property lines. The woman at the counter, Susan, recognized me. I'd pulled permits before for fencing and barn roof. She looked at the pictures, eyebrows knitting together. Did they file anything for a drainage modification? I asked. She tapped around on her computer, squinting at the screen. Not that I'm seeing tied to your parcel so they can just drill through a retaining wall and dump water downhill. She gave me that bureaucratic half shrug. You can file a formal complaint, an inspector will be assigned. It might take a few weeks, maybe longer, depending on workload. A few weeks, I said. My field's underwater. Now, I understand, she said, and I believe she did, but understanding doesn't move paperwork any faster. I filled out the complaint anyway, paid the small filing fee, walked out with a carbon copy in my hand and a sinking feeling in my gut. By the time the county got around to it, my horses would be grazing on algae. When I got home, Arthur was leaning against my fence, chewing on a toothpick, staring at the pipe like it had personally offended him. They do that without asking you, he said. Sure did. He spat into the mud. That ain't right. No, I said, watching the steady trickles still coming out, even though it hadn't rained since dawn. It's not. We stood there for a while in silence. Then he looked at me sideways. You gonna let it stand? That question lingered long after he walked back to his place. Here's the thing about me. I'm not a hothead. I don't pick fights for sport, but I believe in lines. Literal ones, like fences and deeds, and invisible ones, like respect. You cross either without permission, there ought to be consequences. I called Marcus again that afternoon. Look, I said, keeping my voice steady. The county doesn't have any record of permits tied to my property. You installed a pipe that alters runoff onto my land. That's damage." "It's not damage," he replied smoothly. "It's water." And again, it's natural flow. You change the flow. It's within acceptable engineering standards. "Engineering for who?" I asked. His patience thinned. "Thomas, with all due respect, the subdivision has dozens of homeowners relying on proper drainage. We can't have water backing up into their yards, and I can." I shot back. There it was, the quiet hierarchy. Dozens of homeowners with monthly dues versus one guy with a barn and a couple of horses. "We're willing to monitor the situation," he said. "If there's excessive impact, we can reassess." "Define excessive," I said. "If there's structural damage or verified loss." "So, I need my barn flooded before you care." He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "We're done here," and hung up. I stood in my driveway, staring at my phone, feeling something colder than anger settle in. This wasn't an oversight. It was a calculation. They'd looked at a map, seen my pasture as open green space, and decided it was cheaper to let me deal with their runoff than to redesign their system. That night, I pulled out my deed, spread it across the kitchen table. Read every line. Property boundaries, elevation notes. No easements granted to Cedar Creek Estates. No shared drainage agreements. Then I went online and started reading about water law. In Kentucky, surface water is tricky. There's something called the common enemy doctrine. Landowners can protect themselves from surface water, even if it pushes it back onto someone else, as long as they don't act maliciously or negligently. Protect themselves. That phrase stuck. I wasn't required to accept water they artificially concentrated and directed onto my land. And I sure wasn't required to maintain an outlet for their retention pond. The next morning, I made some calls. 4 truckloads of heavy clay-filled dirt. Not the sandy stuff that washes away, but dense, stubborn clay that packs tight. I also called Arthur. "You still got that backhoe?" I asked. He chuckled. "I was wondering when you'd call." By Friday afternoon, we had the first load dumped just inside my fence line, parallel to the retaining wall. The sky was clear for once, sun beating down on the soggy field, steam rising in patches. Arthur climbed into the backhoe like he was 20 years younger. The engine roared to life, metal arms scooping and swinging with slow precision. We built the berm about 2 feet high, thick at the base, sloping slightly back toward my property so it wouldn't collapse. It ran the length of the wall, a solid earthen barrier entirely on my side of the fence. "You're sure about this?" Arthur asked over the engine noise. "I'm sure I'm not letting them drown me," I said. When we reached the section where the pipe stuck through, I took extra care. I laid down a heavy plastic liner against the berm thick enough for pond construction. Then we stacked cinder blocks in a tight half circle around the mouth of the pipe, pressing them into the clay so there were no gaps. I didn't shove anything inside their pipe, didn't trespass beyond my fence. I simply eliminated the low spot on my property where their water had been spilling out. If water came through now, it would hit a wall of compacted clay and reinforced block and have nowhere to go but back the way it came. When we finished, I stood back and wiped sweat off my forehead. It looked almost natural, like the land had grown a spine. For 2 days, nothing happened. The weather held. The pasture began to dry slightly where it could. The horses eyed the new berm suspiciously, but didn't seem to mind. Then Sunday afternoon, the sky darkened again. You could feel it before the first drop fell, that electric heaviness. I moved the horses up near the barn and shut them in for the night. I didn't tell anyone what I expected, but I knew. The rain started slow, then built into a steady downpour. From my porch, I could see the faint outline of the retaining wall beyond the pasture. Lightning flashed, illuminating it in stark white for a split second. I grabbed a flashlight and walked halfway down the slope, stopping short of the berm. Water was already pouring from the pipe, hitting the clay barrier and splashing back. At first, it just pooled at the base. Then the level began to rise, and instead of spilling across my field, it pressed against the wall. I went back up to the porch, sat in a wooden chair, and waited. There's a strange calm that comes when you know you've done everything within your rights, and the rest is just physics. I wasn't cheering. I wasn't gloating. I was listening. The rain fell for hours. Sometime after midnight, I saw it. The faint glow of lights moving along the ridge. Flashlights, then vehicle headlights. And in the distance, over the sound of rain, the unmistakable whine of a pump kicking on. Water, when it can't go downhill, looks for another path. And this time, that path wasn't through my pasture. By morning, the rain had slowed to a mist, the kind that hangs in the air like it hasn't quite decided to leave. I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and looked toward the ridge. Even from my place, I could see something was wrong up there. The retention pond, which usually sat low and neat behind a decorative black fence, had swelled beyond its base. The walking trail that curved around it was underwater. The edge of the tennis courts shimmered with standing water. And near the far corner of the subdivision, 3 houses had sump pumps running full blast, hoses snaking across manicured lawns like panicked veins. I didn't feel joy. What I felt was confirmation. Gravity hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was where the water was allowed to go. Around 9 o'clock, a black SUV came flying down the access road and stopped hard at my gate. Marcus Holloway stepped out, hair plastered to his forehead, loafers sinking into the damp gravel like they'd never met real ground before. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He marched straight up the driveway, barely waiting for me to meet him halfway. "What did you do?" he demanded. I took a slow sip of coffee. "Morning to you too. You obstructed the drainage outlet," he snapped. "The pond is backing up. We've got basements taking on water." "I protected my property," I said evenly. "You can't just block engineered flow." "I didn't block anything on your side," I replied. "I built a berm on my land, entirely within my boundary." His jaw tightened. "You're causing damage." "No," I said. "Your design is." He pointed toward the ridge. 3 homeowners have water in their basements, and I had water in my barn, I said. "Hush. Or did that not count because I don't pay HOA dues?" That hit him, not because it convinced him, but because it exposed the quiet truth neither of us had said out loud. Within the hour, 2 more board members showed up. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who I'd seen once arguing about mailbox colors at a community meeting, started lecturing me about community responsibility. "You live adjacent to Cedar Creek," she said sharply. "Your actions affect all of us." I looked at her and said, "Your actions affected me first. They threatened legal action, injunctions, emergency court orders. I told them they were welcome to try." What they didn't know was that the county inspector had called me at 8 that morning. Susan must have flagged my complaint as urgent once she saw the photos and heard about the flooding. By noon, a white county truck pulled up behind the black SUV. A tall man named David stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but alert. He walked the fence line, examined the pipe, took measurements, asked me when it had been installed. "About 2 weeks ago," I said. "No notice. No easement." He nodded and scribbled something down. Then he asked Marcus for the permit number. There was a pause. The kind that stretches just a little too long. "We're still finalizing some paperwork," Marcus said. David looked up slowly. "The pipe is already operational." "Yes, but operational infrastructure requires approved modification permits," David said flatly, "especially when altering runoff onto an adjacent parcel." Silence settled over the group like a lid. David took more photos. He walked up to the ridge, inspected the pond, spoke briefly with a couple of soaked homeowners who looked more confused than angry. When he came back down, he didn't raise his voice, but what he said carried weight. This installation appears to have been completed without proper authorization, and redirecting concentrated stormwater discharge onto neighboring property without easement is a violation. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Marcus's face went pale. Within 48 hours, emergency pumps were running non-stop to lower the pond. The HOA hired a contractor to temporarily reroute water internally while they scrambled to design a compliance system. Word spread quickly through the subdivision about what had happened. Some homeowners were furious at me. Others were furious at the board for cutting corners. One evening, about a week later, a man from one of the flooded homes knocked on my door. Mid-30s, tired eyes. "I just want to understand," he said. "Did you have to block it like that?" I invited him onto the porch. We sat down. I asked them to fix it. I told him. They said it was standard. They said my land was lowest, so it was natural. He looked out over the pasture, now mostly dry, except for a few soft patches. They told us the system was fully engineered. "I'm sure parts of it were," I said, "just not the part that ended on my fence." He rubbed his forehead. "My kid's playroom flooded." "I'm sorry," I said honestly, "but it was either your playroom or my barn. And they made that choice without asking either of us." That seemed to land. Over the next 2 months, Cedar Creek Estates spent what I later heard was close to $200,000 redesigning their drainage. They tore up a section of the walking trail, installed underground piping that looped back into a reinforced basin entirely within their boundary, and reinforced their pond with additional overflow controls. The concrete pipe that once pointed at my pasture was removed. The hole in the retaining wall sealed and re-stoned face like it had never existed. My berm stayed, not as an act of defiance, but as a reminder. By midsummer, my pasture was green again. The grass grew back thick where it had died. The horses returned to their favorite grazing spot like nothing had ever happened. The barn stayed dry through 2 more storms. But something in me had shifted. I used to believe that most conflicts were misunderstandings that could be solved with a conversation. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes people just need clarity. Other times, they need consequence. I don't hate the folks up on that ridge. I don't wake up hoping their tennis courts crack further, though I hear they're still dealing with some foundation issues from the flooding. What I do believe is that respect for boundaries isn't optional. Not in land, not in life. They assumed because I was one property and they were dozens, I'd absorb the inconvenience. That I'd wait politely while my pasture drowned and my barn risked damage. All so their lawns could stay pristine. Maybe some people would have. Maybe some people think I overreacted. So I'll ask you straight. If someone rerouted their problem onto your land, would you quietly accept it because it was easier? Or would you put your ground back where it belongs and let gravity sort out the rest? Tell me what you think. Was I protecting what was mine, or did I go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone who thought your boundaries were negotiable, share this story with them. Sometimes, the line between right and wrong isn't drawn in ink. Sometimes it's packed in clay. Subscribe to HOA Conflicts for more.